one, and unfortunately I missed the first one as well because they don't let us out of the Midwest that often. But this is Freaks, Confs, and Jail.
Wow, so there's a lot of more people than I kind of expected to see for such a kind of tough act to follow as Rambam there. So I don't have a presentation with me yet because we brought the wrong laptop, but I'm going to start it anyway because I know what the slides are in my head, and you can just kind of visually follow along because who the hell needs PowerPoint or anything like it? So where I'm going to take you back to is something that actually is still an active and ongoing scene. It's the Conf scene, and that's kind of a critical core part of what it is to be a freak from a social perspective, at least. There's obviously a lot of technical freak stuff that has been available this weekend, and I'm sure we've gone over it, but Confs are an area that really hasn't been captured by any of the talks so far, and I've never really talked about this before because I don't want to leave in handcuffs. I'm hoping that that won't happen this time. So what's a conf? Let's kind of take you back to the late 80s and early 90s where a lot of this got started. To be clear, confs existed before that. Freaks would meet on loops to talk and so forth, but really toward the end of the 80s, like 86, 87, 88, is when the big teleconference scene got started. So at this time, there was no big internet series of tubes. There was no real scene as far as being able to meet people electronically. You actually kind of met other freaks, in person at 2600 meetings and the like. So what we had back in the late 80s was 2600 magazine, some 2600 meetings, some things along the lines of local, computer clubs. There was a pretty active one that, guy you may have heard of, Steve Wozniak, was involved with down in Silicon Valley, and he was one of the earlier freaks. But there wasn't really the kind of online communities that you had now. The closest thing that we had at the time was BBSs, and you probably, SketchCow did, I think, a 37-hour-long documentary on the BBS scene that he has for sale this weekend.
It says NT loader not found.
What?
I'm just kidding.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Barcode likes to give me shit about running Windows. So there were some freak BBSs at the time, but basically just to capture the way that you interacted wasn't things like IRC. It wasn't things like message forums. It wasn't a lot of the things that you had now. So you really need to put yourself in that space to kind of understand what this scene's about. So what is a conf? Well, a conf is basically a thing that you can dial into where you can talk to multiple other people all at the same time. And I'm going to try and type my password at the same time. There is never a hope that I've done where things have run on time. And this is actually, I think, not the first equipment malfunction I've had either. So.
God, your password is still secret?
No. So, hey, Barcode, turn your mic on. So let me introduce somebody who's on the stage with me who ran and grabbed my laptop. Okay, hey guys, whoever's running AV, can we get one of these mics turned on somehow? No? All right, you may have to just come. Oh, yeah. Awesome.
That worked.
That one works, but this one doesn't work.
It's my talk now.
It's your talk now.
Can we get his mic on, please?
Yeah.
Hey.
Oh, so are you going to be the conf operator's friend? Okay, do we have video? No? Function F4, do we have video?
How many hackers does it take to get a projector?
Oh, look at that. We got video. Yay. Yes, it's Vista. Yay. Okay, so we already covered this slide. There's so how do you meet other hackers? Well, BBSs, confs, all that sort of thing. And so 2600 at the time was more of a freak publication. And so there was like a real big hardware hacking scene in the late 80s, but there was, basically as far as what we did, it was more freaking. And that's what a lot of the articles, if you look at older issues of 2600 magazine, covered. Blue boxes at the time, I'm sure you've all heard of a blue box, especially if you were at the History of Freaking talk this afternoon. They still worked for the most part, and a lot of people were using them. If you dialed into a BBS, you could dial it into a bit rate of 300, 1200, and 2400 BPS, which is good enough for text, but not really much in terms of downloads. Most of them were long distance. Does anybody raise your hand if you remember like actually getting a long distance bill over $100?
I don't know who got my long distance bill.
So I'm surprised actually that we have that many people, but if you were a BBS sysop especially, you were accustomed to getting a phone bill at least $500 typically any given month. So toll charges were real. People wanting to find ways to avoid them legally or not was actually a fairly big deal. And I got busted just to kind of like reveal my age a bit. You can do the math. I got busted in 7th grade for blue boxing and for AllNet codes, if anybody remembers what AllNet was. So, class of 1992, still internet access wasn't widely available. There was a big debate raging on the internet, which was still largely an academic and government network at the time, over whether to let AOL on. They probably shouldn't have. BBSs were really in their heyday, and I got in on the game. I was running the bin BBS, which had kind of a secret area for freaking stuff in it and wares and the like. And it's kind of funny because the Dark Tangent and I were both in Seattle, and we traded messages back and forth since we had a relay network, and had a lot of the same users. He ran a Dark Tangent system. And 2600, not to be outdone, ran a BBS, but with a twist. It was the 2600 voice BBS. And so if you didn't have a computer, you could call into the voice BBS and you could participate in an online message forum, sort of, except you dialed in. Blue boxes, by the early 90s, we'd mostly gone to digital switching, and so for the most part, you could still bounce off C5 networks in some foreign countries. You could bounce off of China Direct, for example, but it was pretty avant-garde. Like the techniques that people had learned, like Dial Armory recruiting and Blue Box off of that, off of their toll-free number, largely didn't work anymore. Red boxes still did work, and in fact, a lot of calls to the 2600 voice BBS, most of them, is my guess, were made by Red Box. I made more than a few of them from the payphone at the school a block away from my parents' house, and it was considered like, we have netiquette now. Well, one of the pieces of 2600 voice BBS etiquette, which was widely ignored, was don't blow tones into the phone, like making fake quarters while you're leaving a message on the voice BBS. So you'd be listening to a message, somebody saying something, and then to cut in, please deposit 25 cents for the next 1 minute, and somebody deposit a fake quarter. And then Confs, which we talked about already, began to gain popularity, but there were not a lot of conferencing systems, and Alliance teleconferencing, run by AT&T, was the primary one that people were using. And these things were very expensive. Typically you would pay 40 to 50 cents per minute per participant, so they were kind of aimed at high-end businesses. So why, if you're a freak, would you want a conf? Well, it's a social thing. You could talk to other people who had similar interests. On the phone, nobody knows that you're a 16-year-old pimply-faced dork in Wisconsin somewhere. And very often, when you get a whole bunch of people with a phone and a big ego and a lot of boredom together, some hilarity ensued. So Barcode got into the conf scene when he was in high school, and what was it like, Barcode, coming home from high school, putting your backpack down and calling the conf?
Well, I thought you were 6 feet tall and black the first time I heard your voice on the phone.
Yeah, so I have this, telephone voice that's kind of intimidating and big. And nobody knows that I'm, at the time, 18 and 110 pounds. And I had the same voice then as I do now. Of course, I don't talk like that anymore, but...
No, I think he's right. It was very much a social thing, and in Sacramento specifically, which we'll get into later, which is where I'm from, we had a pretty active hacker community, I guess you could say. This is just around the time the 2600 meeting out there started. And what is it, 93, 94? Something.
2600 meeting
No,
started,
no, in Sacramento.
Oh, in Sacramento. Yeah, I think it was 93.
Yeah. And the reason we probably got into the Confs is because a lot of them were based out of Sacramento. There was a telephone company out there that was somewhat less than responsible with shredding their trash.
That wouldn't be MCI, would it?
Yeah. And and the prophet here had ultimately somehow up in Seattle where he was gotten a hold of some of the conf numbers. They were just voice bridges that they'd set up for these multi-level marketing companies. And by the time I first called in, I don't remember what the hell was going on the first time I called into one of those conferences, but it certainly wasn't something where I wanted my voice to be heard.
Yeah, so if any of you think that Amway serves no use for anything, they were a great source of confs in the early 90s, because what they would do is they'd set up these teleconferences and they'd have all these Amway people call in, and they do, you know, their big Amway rah-rah meeting, like, we're going to sell stuff and we're going to show the plan, and we're all going to be on the Diamond Yacht, and we're just going to be with Rich DeVos and Jay Van Andel and selling Amway. And then they'd hang up and we'd call in and start three-weighing McDonald's and asking them to take their registers apart. But, you know, anyway.
Well, I also thought it was interesting that they would set those confs up to use for an hour and they would be up for 6 months.
Yeah, this is true. Well, sometimes these, you know, these guys would dial, like, we'd be on the conf, you know, doing something, and then all of a sudden, like, 8 people would join, and, you know, it'd be like, hi, this is Bob from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm here to talk to you about Melaleuca today. And, you know, like, sometimes this happened at awkward times, like when we were three-wayed with, you know, like airlines trying to get them to, you know, give us free tickets or something. So, yeah, I guess that segues nicely into prank calls. So, one of our favorite companies to prank was OCI. And this was an alternate operator service. So, you know about Verizon and, you know, the Baby Bells and the large long-distance companies like Sprint and so forth. Well, there were a lot of providers that we'd call telesleaze providers that basically existed to rip you off when you made phone calls on your calling card from payphones by hoping you wouldn't notice that it was like some sleazy provider instead of the real phone company. And OCI was pretty much at the top of that game. And the great thing with OCI is they had this toll-free backdoor number that you could dial into and get an OCI operator, and they had no idea where you were calling from. There was no ANI on this thing. So
you're leaving off one important part of information, which is that OCI had a very strict policy that their operators could not hang up on you without manager approval.
Yeah, that was the other best part. So it was pretty interesting. You know, they could only make collect calls and the like, but, you know, we'd call OCI and ask them all sorts of really unusual questions, and we'd try to make collect calls to, you know, very unlikely places that we knew they couldn't make calls to, like Libya. It probably sounds less funny than it was, but just put yourself in that place. You're 16 years old, you're on the phone with a bunch of your friends, and you're calling somebody that can't hang up on you no matter how ridiculous the proposition that you put across the line is. And, you know, it really is a lot of fun even now because they still can't hang up on you. Yeah, so 1-800-288-2880, by the way, for OCI if you want to try your hand with them.
Don't do it, please.
There was, so putting yourself back into cellular phones at the time, they were all crackly analog, and we didn't have the nationwide cellular networks that we do now. So often you travel from one city to another and your cell phone wouldn't work, and you'd get put through to this thing called Cellular Express, where for the mere low price of, I think, $3.99 a minute plus a $5 setup fee and who knows what else, you could make, you know, domestic phone calls on a crackly analog cellular, outgoing only. Well, that was really fun because they had a backdoor toll-free number too, and they also didn't know where you were calling from. They just thought that you were calling from some part of the country that you weren't in. So Magnate, one of the freaks that was on one of the conferences we called quite a bit, decided to become Bob the operator's friend. And so he'd call up, usually at least 15 times a day and sometimes more than that. And he got to know every single operator in this center and find out, what the layout of their cubicles was, because he'd just call incessantly